agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good afternoon, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this afternoon?
Well, I am, as I reported earlier, I am still at work here at Freedom Defense Headquarters, watching the snow come down. But still, yes, happy to
ready to go,
happy to be able to make it.
There you go. All right. Well, hey, before we do get started, I want to let everyone know that we are hoping to make a significant audio production upgrade by getting an actual made-for-podcasting audio mixer as opposed to, well, the thing I used and put together in our early days. Now, of course, we're a small operation. We run on really tight margins, and so we're hoping you might consider helping us out. And the reason we'd like to do this is that it will make it easier for us to do more for you guys. And to that end, if we're able to get the cost of this mixer fully funded, it's going to end up being around $650. I promise everyone there that in return, you'll not only get better audio quality, but that we will, at a minimum, double the number of midweek interview episodes that we gave you last year. So if that's something you're interested in, yeah, that's a lot. So if you're interested in helping us out with this, you can contribute through PayPal or Venmo. On Venmo, we're at Politics Guys, and you can find our PayPal link and all of our support links in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. Thanks so much. All right, so today we're going to be talking about, well, of course, Russia and Ukraine, President Biden's executive order on cryptocurrency, Congress finally passing a budget almost halfway through the fiscal year, postal service reform, anti-gay laws, and maybe some more stuff. We will see, but a whole bunch to have for you today. And before we get to that, though, we'll take a quick break and be right back. All right, so we open with the ongoing Russia invasion of Ukraine. Now, as the war enters its third week, Russian forces, which are still facing much stiffer than expected resistance, have turned to more indiscriminate and some would say even criminal tactics in their push to capture major Ukrainian cities and cut off the supply routes that Western countries have been using to provide desperately needed arms and other aid to Ukrainians. Now, right now, the best estimates seem to be that the war has resulted in somewhere between 6,000 to 10,000 deaths and around 3 times that many wounded and over 2 million Ukrainian refugees. And by almost all accounts, things will get worse before there's any realistic hope of their getting better. On Tuesday of this week, the Biden administration banned all imports of Russian oil and natural gas. The United Kingdom followed by announcing a plan to phase out all Russian oil products by the end of the year. And EU officials pledged to cut Russian gas imports by 2/3 by the end of this year. And earlier today, President Biden called on Congress to join the EU and the other G7 countries to end normal trade relations with Russia, saying Putin is the aggressor and Putin must pay a price. And late this week, also, the House approved a $13.6 billion in aid for Ukraine. That's part of that $1.5 trillion budget bill, which we'll be discussing later on in the show. That actually more than doubles the administration's initial request of $6.4 billion in aid to Ukraine. And of course, most folks have heard that Poland stepped up and offered to send its entire fleet of Russian MiG-29 fighters to the U.S., to the U.S.'s Ramstein Air Base in Germany to then transfer them to Ukraine in exchange for the U.S. providing Poland with used aircraft with similar capability to the MiGs they'd be donating. Now, it's a significant offer. The 30 Polish jets would represent around a 43% increase in the size of Ukraine's fighter jet fleet, at least from where it stood before the Russian invasion. But the Biden administration rejected this offer, calling it not tenable, with Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby saying that fighter jets departing from a U.S. NATO base in Germany to fly into airspace that is contested with Russia over Ukraine raises serious concerns for the entire NATO alliance. Kirby also said that defense analysts in the U.S. concluded that a transfer wouldn't make operational sense because the Polish jets are not likely to significantly change the effectiveness of the Ukrainian Air Force relative to Russian capabilities. Now, 42 Republican senators voiced their disagreement with this in a letter to President Biden this week, calling on the administration to work with Poland and our NATO allies to expedite the transfer of urgently needed air power, air defense systems, and other combat and support capabilities from the United States, NATO allies, and other European partners to Ukraine. And finally, then, there's the corporate pullout from Russia, which also continues with over 300 companies having halted business in or with Russia. Estimated Russian job losses from sanctions boycotts are now in the tens of thousands. The ruble is nearly worthless. Russia's sovereign debt has been downgraded to junk status. And according to the Institute for International Finance, the Russian economy is projected to shrink by 15% this year. That's compared to a 3% growth projection estimated prior to the invasion. So, and I'm sure there are a bunch of things I missed, Jay. There's an awful lot going on. So why don't we break this down? Why don't we start with, I think, one of the big things that people were talking about, particularly the administration's decision to not take Poland up on its offer. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's disappointing and disconcerting for a number of reasons. First, there were signals early on that the administration was on board with the Polish proposal. For example, Jen Psaki had talked about this transfer and backfilling planes to Poland. Likewise, I think John Kirby had made statements regarding that sounded sort of like a good idea, and backfilling planes to Poland. And as the news seems to be, it seems to be President Biden himself who pulled the plug on this, and that's a little troubling to me for a number of reasons. I mean, it's one thing to say we're standing strong, but we're not going to do that, and I'm not sure the difference, the reason why, right? I mean, if the idea is that the Russians were to say, well, now under international law, you could be a belligerent, and we could try to knock these planes out while they're at Ramstein Airfield. If that's the case, well, then that's where we are, right? That's World War III, and if they want to start it, look, if their claim is don't help Ukraine or else we're going to attack a NATO country, then what good is NATO to begin with? And those other NATO allies should start, would have some concern, I'd imagine. Secondly, I understand the rationale between saying, look, we're not going to enforce a no-fly zone, which would necessarily bring Russian and American planes into conflict. But this seems to be a compromise that could be done. And again, if the Russians believe that they can simply attack the NATO planes or NATO pilots flying over airspace of a sovereign nation, not belligerently attacking Russia, I think that tells us where we are. So I'm disappointed with that. Now, maybe there's a better solution, a better way to do it to get this done. That's what I'm hopeful. That maybe there's some other back door we can use to get these planes to the Ukrainians. But it troubles me because it shows something of a lack of resolve.
Well, let me.
And look, we're talking. I understand we're talking about brinksmanship, but if you look back to say like the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, if President Kennedy said, "Yeah, I'll not really have a blockade," right? I mean,
let's recall the other part of that Cuban Missile Crisis, where we agreed to pull some missiles out of, I believe it was Turkey, and that didn't come out till after the fact. So, there's a lot we don't know here, Jay. You're often fond of saying when it comes to military and intelligence things that there's an awful lot that we don't know. And I'm not saying that you're wrong here. And I'm not saying that those 42 Republican senators are wrong, but there, to me, is an interesting push to trust the military and defense officials as long as we agree with them. But then when we don't, maybe we should just assume that they're wrong. And so I think that the fact that defense analysts at the Pentagon have suggested that would not make really an operational difference, but it could significantly it could significantly heighten the possibility for escalation. That's a reasonable thing to weigh. Now, of course, people can come to different conclusions weighing that in, but I don't think it's an unreasonable decision to make. I mean, according to Flight Global, I guess they're an analytics firm about military sizes. Russia has over 1,500 combat aircraft. Ukraine has 98. And so I think the argument in terms of operational differences, how much of a difference can it make? Now, you could make the same argument for basically any aspect of the military, of course, but there are certain lines over which, and I'm sure this is the main part of it, where, as you said, well, when does brinksmanship actually go over that line? And it's a lot easier, of course, from us sitting here to say, well, yeah, go ahead and do by all means necessary, short of actual U.S. troops in that country. But Putin may not see it that way. And so what we're doing is we're gambling with potentially thousands or tens of thousands of lives, and that should give us pause.
Yeah, no doubt. And like I said, that's why I sort of put in my caveat of maybe there's some backdoor in the works that we don't know about. But I don't think that the rationale saying, well, Ukrainians don't really need them works
of
very
course
well.
not. I mean, of course not.
Come on, what's a couple extra planes? It's not going to make a difference. And what it does is it's almost, like we started the show a week or two ago with the pay any price, bear any burden, except we're not going to get you planes. To me, it strikes me as that of saying here's what we're not going to do. Every time we say that, Putin knows he's got a little more leeway.
Well, sure. I mean, that's because he's willing to, as a dictator, in essence, he's willing and able to sacrifice a lot more than we are, because it's not his sacrifices, basically.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but it's also there's a price to pay for brinksmanship, right? There's risks there, but there's also a corresponding risk of ignoring it.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And I think this is not. Given the fact that we don't hit, there's a lot, I am sure there was a lot going on that the general public is not privy to, that it makes these calculations even more difficult for us to sort of armchair quarterback either way, of course.
Sure.
So, but yeah. Let's also talk about that corporate pullout. That's another big thing. I mean, some companies have claimed concerns with worker safety, but it seems really much more about what you often hear called reputational risk, right? That kind of term of art. And some people say, well, is this cancel culture at work? And so I'm going to ask you, Jay, is this cancel culture? And either way, whether you call it that or not, do you think it's the right move for all these companies to make?
It is cancel culture a little bit. But I would say that the big distinction is so often when conservatives like me complain about cancel culture, what we're complaining about is someone losing their job because of an opinion they hold or something that they have said or a lot of times association that is not even theirs, right? That they're just sort of lumped in with someone else, and words are ascribed to them, and therefore they're canceled, or they're deemed to be anything they say is deemed to be so inflammatory that they can't even say it, and you're canceled just because you have a reputation for being inflammatory. I think there's a difference of canceling someone for an opinion they hold or statements they make versus attacking a sovereign country for no reason and bombing maternity hospitals and killing thousands of innocent people and intentionally targeting civilians. And there's a big difference there between tolerating an opinion you don't like and standing up to actual aggression with bombs and tanks and guns and so forth.
Yeah, so I agree, and I think it's important to point out that this isn't just essentially unprovoked aggression, and Putin can say all he wants about the denazification and what have you, but it's also in violation of what we've seen in many instances of basic international agreements on how to conduct war and indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. I mean, there are war crimes investigations that are already beginning to start up, and it seems there's increasing evidence that Russia is in fact committing more and more war crimes here.
Yeah, no, so I agree wholeheartedly with these companies that want to get out of Russia. I think it's good on them, and they're willing to take maybe a financial hit, but they're also probably figuring that they'd take a bigger financial hit if they didn't.
Yeah.
So
and I think it's interesting in Russia, leaders and media are sort of trying to spin this as a good thing that they're kind of turning away from the decadent West and embracing, true Russianness. We don't even want McDonald's or Levi's or Starbucks, except, this was, of course, for you and for the two of us, old Cold Warriors, this is a very familiar line, except the context, it seems to me, is very different. Russia started opening up to Western companies, Western culture in the early to mid 90s, a few years after the Soviet Union fell. And that's nearly 30 years ago. And if you look, the median age in Russia is just under 40, which means that half of all Russians don't really even have solid memories of their country not being a place where they could access Western brands and Western culture. And all of a sudden, that comes to a screeching halt. And I think that the thinking of the people in charge in Russia, which is basically Putin at this point, and a few oligarchs who he's risen up with him. I mean, these are guys in their 60s and 70s. And so I think that they're tremendously out of touch. And I don't think that they appreciate the extent to which, especially the younger folks in Russia, expect Western culture and Western consumer products. And I wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. If you can even think back to our days, it was always a big thing of, trading blue jeans
Levi's,
to the East, yep. Right? I mean, that was a thing of, they would, they wanted European or Western goods so bad, and that was such a big part of even the Berlin Wall falling, right? East Berlin consumers wanting what they saw just across the other side, and why can't we have nice things? Like the West Berliners do, and I don't mean to make that sound shallow or commercialized or something like that. I mean, it's a Soviet economy, Soviet products. Where
awful. They were just
right?
bad.
Yugo, right?
Oh, yeah.
That was the. So I think that was if you look back to the 80s and 70s even. I mean, that whole Western culture and, rock and roll and all that was a weapon against what was sort of the dour, staid, brutalism, communist, aesthetic. Somebody that posted the other day saw the old Wendy's commercial, right? And you know what I'm talking about, the Russian fashion show.
Yeah.
Where it's this,
getting visions in my head.
Overweight older woman in a babushka and sort of the nightwear, and she walks out with a flashlight and day wear, and she comes out with. But the idea is that yes, everything was all the same. Everything was of low quality. You didn't have any choice in what you bought. I think Russian consumers are going to miss that, and they're going to push back strenuously.
And not only that, Jay, I want to say
has it in there to fix that.
Yeah, I say not only that, but Russia imports by far the vast majority of their consumer goods. I think a number I saw was over 75%. And in certain categories, it's even higher. And so it's not that they even have equivalents at this point, because they've gotten integrated enough into the world economy that this is going to be felt far more than it would be by, Russians in the 70s or 80s, when not only were they used to it and didn't expect high quality Western decadent goods, but there was at least an infrastructure to provide them with other goods, but a lot of that infrastructure is just not there. And so I think that's important. But also I think when we think about Putin's popularity and how this is all going to kind of trickle down. I mean, right now, according to the best polling estimates we have, Putin is actually still really popular in Russia. Well, way more popular than Joe Biden or Donald Trump or a lot of other Western leaders are, and that's genuine. I mean, pollsters have adjusted for all kinds of things, and these seem to be pretty solid numbers. And of course, no, and you can all you want, but the fact of the matter is when you have that sort of control. And when you have a big segment of the population who still gets most of their information from state-controlled TV, now I'm sure you break that down demographically. You look at the under 40 population, under 30 population. Those are the people who are out there in the street protest getting arrested in that. So my point being is that Putin has more popularity than a lot of people in the West want to admit or understand. But I also think that this media blackout can only go so far, because when you have thousands arrested in anti-war protests, that's one thing. And also when you have thousands of people that are dying and getting hurt, well, Putin can't just wish that away, right? And so that comes back eventually. And so I think the overall pressure of all this, assuming that the West can keep it up, will eventually bear fruit. Though it's going to be painful all around.
Yeah, I'm a little more skeptical of look, if I'm in Moscow and the phone rings and they ask me what my opinion of Vladimir Putin is, realizing that Vladimir Putin might be listening on the other end, I most people would respond that it's pretty high.
My point is that that's not how polling works in those situations. It's a lot more complex than that. I understand that's a common misapprehension that polling is that simplistic. And without getting into a sort of discourse on how you poll in those sort of situations, I would say that a lot of very smart people have worked on some pretty clever ways to get around a lot of that. And my overall point is that Putin is not a hated leader by his people. He's not ready to be toppled or anything like that.
Yeah. And I don't know, that's what those guys always think until they're not. I mean, if you look back again to the Cold War era, there was when I would think that the Soviet Union had a much tighter control over information than it does now. There was still always the sense, right, of Russian people that everybody knew it was, the party line was BS. Because they, again, just for the very reasons of they could see what's going on in West Berlin and other places. I think that still exists, and we maybe just don't have a good way to measure it. Now, you have more confidence in the pollsters.
Well, not only that,
but you're right. But
But I think the narrative, actually, Putin's narrative, while it seems ridiculous to us, I think doesn't seem ridiculous to an awful lot of Russians. I mean, I think an awful lot of Russians are more than willing to buy into Russia as the eternal victim of the West. That fits into a larger cultural narrative that's been baked in, that's been baked in for centuries in Russians. And so that plays into something I think very deep and primal in many Russians, and they're willing to pick that up. And so I don't think that's unreasonable to think that at all. And like I said, what evidence we have seems to support that. Now, where I think you and I agree is that can't hold out indefinitely in the face of pretty significant deprivation.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Levi's and McDonald's aside, if your economy is going to be shrinking by 15%, that's going to put a hurt on everyone. So there we go. Speaking of pain, a number of Republicans are arguing that the Biden administration's, what they would, I'm sure, call anti-fossil fuel policies, and that's fair to a certain extent, that they're exacerbating the current situation, leading to a greater supply shortage than there would otherwise be, and resulting in, most notably, record high gas prices for Americans, at least if you don't adjust for inflation, which you really should. Another issue, we'll get to that maybe. But I wanted to get your take on that argument as well, the extent to which current Biden administration policies have sort of made this situation worse on the energy
I'm going to take the sort of a middle road here, because on the one hand, some of the rhetoric of the this is all Joe Biden. I just filled my tank with $67 worth of gas, which is, I think, the first in my lifetime. I can't remember that. Do I think that is entirely Biden's fault? No. But at the same time, some of the first steps that Biden took in taking office and some of the things he campaigned on was to prevent or reduce our capacity to produce fossil fuels. We embargoed Russian oil, but before that, I mean, he killed the pipeline and essentially embargoed Canadian oil. And it's a weird sort of situation where we like to pretend that we are climate virtuists and say we're not going to get our hands dirty, we're not pumping oil, we're not drilling offshore anymore, we're not fracking, and yet we'll just buy this from the Russians. Or even if we're not, and again, I understand oil is a commodity, it's fungible, so it's not like you're necessarily hey, give me 30 barrels of Russian oil, please. But that all fits into the global supply, and if we make up that global supply on our own, then we're less dependent when these kind of things happen. And we've been in a situation for some 50 years now where a lot of countries that have a lot of oil are not always our friends or terribly reliable. And I think it just makes good sense strategically and even economically that we always have a domestic capacity that we can turn on and off pretty quick. So would that have prevented these price shocks? Probably not. Would it protect us against this kind of thing in the longer term? I think so. Right. Anytime you have a war that's knocking out a big chunk of fuel supply, immediately there's going to be a hit. The question is, how long does it take us to make up that capacity? And I think we'd be better positioned if we had a policy that focused on more domestic production.
Yeah, so I'm gonna agree with you, and not even really disagree in any way, but maybe expand and take this into a slightly different direction. So I don't think you're wrong about any of that. I think it's fair
Good.
to.
I'm not.
And we agree. Jay's not wrong, but I think the overwhelming reason for decreased production in the U.S., even according to energy companies, was the pandemic, right? And now you just made, I think, a reasonable argument concerning fossil fuels and longer-term energy policy. I mean, I may differ about certain things, but it's not an unreasonable argument, right? Now, on the whole, a couple of things I wanted to get into more specifically. The cost of gasoline, I kind of hinted at that, right? If we look at the cost of gasoline in inflation-adjusted dollars, well, it's actually not at an all-time high, and actually, the most reasonable way to look at the cost of gasoline is in what's called inflation-adjusted price per mile driven. That takes into effect, of course, inflation and the fact that modern vehicles are more fuel efficient, which means it costs less to go, a certain number. You need fewer gallons to go.
Yeah, but the price of gas doesn't change.
But it does, because if it takes you half as much gas to go the same distance, then you're spending half as much on gas, priced the same. So it absolutely is a factor.
A gallon of gas costs what it costs, regardless of how far it takes you.
But if you have a car that gets 40 miles to a gallon as opposed to 20, you need half as much gas.
Right, but that doesn't change the price of gas.
No, but it changes the cost of gas to consumers.
All right.
I see what you're saying.
Price
versus cost.
You want to put it that way.
Yes. And if you look at it that way, actually, by that measure, current prices aren't anywhere near close to record highs. Now, again, I'm not saying that where they are is a good thing. I'm just suggesting that we need some kind of historical perspective on this. And I also think
Although, I mean, I would want to note too, though. I mean, the Biden administration, I don't think, can get away with saying, "Oh, hey, it's all Russia." The "I did that" stickers at the gas pumps and all that. That was going on a long time before 3 weeks ago. If you want to say that this most recent spike is because of Russian instability, and not even necessarily a reduction in that production, but it's more, to me, it's sort of I think they look at futures, right? I mean, what's going to be produced and what's going to be available on the market when factoring in their prices. So, I don't think the Biden administration can say, look at that Putin. And then the other thing I think that is I think there are plenty of Americans, myself among them, who would be happy and proud to say, you know what, I'm willing to pay extra at the pump to support the Ukrainians. But they're again, people weren't happy with what they were paying at the pump 3 weeks ago before this happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And while most of that is pandemic related, certainly, I mean, decisions made by administrations do have effects on futures. And I think most of the effects, and I think most energy analysts would say that most of the effects of a president whose administration has been in office for barely over a year, they're yet to be felt. That's a different discussion than what we're seeing now. But
on day one, when the signal is I'm closing off, all this area for drilling, I'm closing off offshore drilling. I'm going to ban all the fracking I can. I'm going to cancel the pipeline. Surely, I think oil producers realize, hey, we're not going to have this sort of domestic capacity, or at least the ability to come online anytime soon, and it discourages them from making any kind of investments that would grow capacity.
Right, yeah. And I'm not saying that's not a factor. I'm just saying that tends to be more of a factor as you get further down the line. So we're not really disagreeing on that, I don't think, so much as maybe it's a disagreement in terms of kind of
right, of degree. I think
degree.
that's probably right. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned,
but all things considered, I mean, I guess there's a strange thing in the West, and I suppose it's not, maybe it's more American, but I guess it's Western. But the sense of we don't want to get our hands dirty, but we're perfectly willing to let other people get their hands dirty. And if you also figure that the oil that we would produce, I'm guessing would probably be done with more environmental protections in place than whatever the Russians do, or the Saudis, or the Venezuelans. Or any of those other folks who are typically not as friendly as we'd like them to be. And when you do this, and we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, when Europe sort of abandoned the nuclear.
Germany
option.
really, but particularly, but Germany, of course, is the largest economy in Europe. France is doing its all for new.
Damn song I talked about a couple weeks ago. Yeah. Abandoned nuclear power, and didn't really make up for it with any kind of fossil fuel power. It just says we're just going to rely on renewables and rely on these other people who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty in making oil. That puts you at their mercy.
No, and I think you alluded to this a couple of times. This whole notion of energy independence is really, I think, misunderstood because, as you pointed out, fossil fuel prices are set in global markets, and so U.S. producers import and export based on global market prices, not on any kind of notion of energy independence. And so,
yes and no, but consider. We get these flashpoints, right? 73, Arab oil embargo, Suez crisis, the war in Russia now. You get these flashpoints when all of a sudden you can have that international source or foreign source shut off entirely. Then I think that is a different question. I mean, energy independence and gas prices are not the same question; they're related.
Sure.
But I think there's a strategic purpose in having energy independence. Now we have the silly strategic petroleum reserves, which is supposed to help us if the global supply of oil gets shut off because of some geopolitical crisis. And of course it would get us through a couple days, and it's usually used just to knock gas prices down a couple cents. But I think there's a security interest that goes beyond just energy prices.
Well, yeah, and I agree. It's coming to there was a tweet by Elon Musk earlier this week. He said, hopefully it's now extremely obvious that Europe should restart dormant nuclear power stations and increase power output of existing ones. This is critical to national and international security. And now
He's my favorite billionaire.
Yeah.
By the way,
I don't have it.
As billionaires go, I mean.
Oh my, he makes me want to throw up pretty much. Anyway, Elon Musk aside, who anyway, I have issues with. But my point being is that I think he's got a point here. And I would say it applies not just to nuclear, which is I see as sort of a short-term bridge solution, but to renewables in general, because as you know, most fossil fuels, even though the U.S. has huge supplies that are untapped yet, most of those fossil fuels are from not so great countries. Right. I mean, now we're in negotiations of some sort with Venezuela. Right. I mean, why?
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And so I think, of course, as we've seen with concerns about Chernobyl and that any nuclear plant is going to be inherently more vulnerable to a major accident resulting from a direct military attack if someone wanted to do that. Right. I mean, there's no getting around the fact that radiation is a necessary part of nuclear power generation. And so, but even so, I think, nuclear needs to be part of a larger energy independence discussion that also involves renewables, which if you take a look at cost of renewables compared to fossil fuels, been going way, way down as economies of scale and so forth ramp in. And so this is a very different conversation we have today than we would have had even 5 years ago when comparing those costs. And that has to be part of the energy independence conversation as well, I would think.
I think so, but also, I mean, consider what if in some future conflict, the Chinese say, we are no longer going to provide, let's say 10, 15 years down the road, all this wonderful Build Back Better stuff gets passed and we go to completely green energy and it's sunshine and birds and flowers blooming. But then we get into a little tiff with China and they say, you know what, we're not going to provide you the rare earth elements that you need to make these solar panels. We're not going to make these solar panels. We're not going to have our slaves in the Jiangxi province make these panels for you. That goes to the same thing. If at that point we are up a creek because we depend too much on a foreign country for a vital commodity.
Agreed, but there's one thing we haven't talked about in this discussion, and maybe to you it's not as much of an issue, but to me and to a lot of folks on the left, it is the defining issue of our generation and the most important issue that there is, and that's the issue of climate change. And if you just sort of assume that we'll figure something out about climate change, then yeah, we can just talk about security aspects, and I would probably agree with you a whole lot more. But to me, and again, to an awful lot of people on the left, and an awful lot of people who study this kind of thing, would say that no, this is actually an existential threat to large segments of the human population, and so therefore we have to weigh that in as well because there are very important costs associated with that. And now I know that you are, I will call you a technological optimist, and you just assume we'll kind of find a way because we always have. But there are people, a lot of people like me, who aren't nearly as sanguine as you are, and aren't willing to be quite as cavalier about the future of life for billions of people.
Well, and I think my position can best be described as balancing immediate risks versus future potential risks. I would guarantee you that there's nobody in Kyiv right now who's really worried about global warming.
Probably not. No, I would say.
Right. I mean, that's
no, yeah.
But look, if we have a policy that empowers dictators, to undertake this type of aggression, that's the more immediate problem that we need to look at. I'm not saying we don't look at climate change, don't move towards finding solutions, but those solutions should not be a matter of surrendering our immediate security against a potential problems down the road.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. And in fact, I would say that if anything, events of the last few weeks have made a stronger argument for putting more weight onto the immediate security, because what we've been talking about prior to this was largely economic security and growth and that sort of thing. And that's usually when you and I have this conversation, which we've had, a number of times over the years. That's what we focus on. But now we see that there is a very real, not just the threat, but the reality of a petrostate going to war and starting a war. And so that makes even more of a case for maybe weighing some of those near-term interests over the longer term. So if anyone got the sense that I was saying, Jay doesn't care about the lives of billions of people, it may have come out that way in the moment, but I certainly, like you said, it's
you say that all the time.
Well, yeah, it's a good idea. But no, but seriously, it is a balance, right? And this has to weigh into that balance. And, there are people, I've read things even now about, the horrible climate impacts of this war in Ukraine. Yeah, absolutely. But of course,
right.
we have
John Kerry said that sort of stuff.
But
too much eye rolling.
But it's true. But of course, there are, like you said, more immediate problems, certainly. So, last question before we get on to another story. How do you see things developing here in the near term? I mean, do you see any sort of a end game or a way out for Putin that doesn't involve, I don't know, even greater devastation? Or is this, I don't know.
There's a very weird irony, and there was a Wall Street Journal piece, and I'm trying to think, maybe Daniel Henniger wrote it. I'm trying to, but if you had asked me where I thought we'd be at this point a couple weeks ago when the invasion started, I would have said, and I think I may have even said, the Russians are going to roll over them. They're going to move in. They'll install a puppet government, and you'll have sort of some resistance fighting along, probably for years, but that would be the end of it.
And also added to that the West would do something, but not nearly what it's done.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Me too. Yep.
Yeah. I really anticipated that this would be much more like the Crimean invasion, where we would protest vociferously and shake our heads, and and the difference being we'd offer lethal aid this time as opposed to just the humanitarian aid we offered then. But that in the end of the day, the well-supplied Russian military would just roll over Ukraine. But that's not what happened. And on the one hand, that's fantastic that that's not what happened. And it's due to the bravery of the Ukrainian people and Zelensky, and it's due to NATO and Western nations stepping up more than I thought they would. Now, again, I think there's more to do. For example, MiGs, and I could also take some swipes at our oil embargo and some of these other sanctions that I've read are going to take effect sometime in June, which seems to be kind of a little
after
late.
The fact, yeah.
And I can also argue about we should have imposed sanctions, but that's neither here nor there. We are at this point, and the issue now is that because it's not going to end quickly, and Putin is unlikely to, they've sort of put themselves into two routes. Either the Russians will completely conquer Ukraine, or Putin will fall. And that's a little scarier situation because it very much raises the stakes as far as what will Putin do. He's sort of doesn't have an off ramp, or at least there's not one visible at this point. To just get out of there, to say, okay, I'm installing a puppet government and we're done, or to say, now I suppose he could say, hey, good news, guys, we got all the Nazis, it's all cleaned up now, and we can pull out. But I don't think that's his style, and
especially now, I would say, because if your livelihood literally depends on projecting strength, and all you've projected so far is weakness, he can't let this stand. He has to take Kiev. He has to militarily overrun Ukraine, I think, at this point. And if that means that every kind of war crime and atrocity has to be committed, so be it. If that means that 20,000 Russian troops have to die, so be it. But this is going to happen, and the fact of the matter is the Russian military, even with all the Western help, is large enough just by sheer force of numbers and mass that they will make that happen. And I think that's just a matter of time. And I don't think there's any getting around that. It's a question of what happens after that point. And I think anyone who says they know is totally full of it, I think.
Right. And the optimistic view, and people sort of called for this. Lindsey Graham, I think, called and sort of known as, but of a palace coup.
Yeah, and
now again, that's usually easier said than done.
And not only that, but a lot of times like you and I were thinking about Russia and the situation a few weeks ago through the lens of Crimea in 2014, more or less, right?
Yeah.
As you pointed out,
Right.
And a lot of
they just waltzed right in. Yeah.
And a lot of people think about the Russian leadership through a lens that's similarly outdated. The sort of Putin oligarch structure that's in place now is not about like Putin as first among equals or anything like that. I mean, over the last 15 or so years, Vladimir Putin has been very clever in making sure that these people who came up specifically because of their connections to him. And so really there are not these independent power sources that there were in the early 2000s. This is a very different situation. And so it's going to take considerably more pressure than a lot of people, I think, are willing to realize, I guess, before we see anything like that happening. I mean, that would be great, but, I just don't see it happening.
I mean, although some of these oligarchs are going to start feeling it in the pocketbook very quickly.
Yeah, but of course you can feel an awful lot when you're a billionaire.
Oligarch,
before, and I'll lose a couple $100 million here, or Putin will have me and my family killed. Well, there's two bad options, but one is less bad than the other. You can always make that money back by becoming a member in good standing or keeping your good standing as part of the kleptocratic Putin state. So there you go. So pretty depressing note, I think, just generally speaking. And neither of us really sees anything good happening in the next few weeks, at least. Fair to say?
Fair to say. Although I'm still a believer that Putin is not insane.
What do you mean?
I think he still weighs consequences, and this is becoming more costly. I'm not saying I'm optimistic, but I think we do better projecting strength, and certainly projecting weakness does nothing to discourage him.
Not him, especially. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, if you are a Politics Guy supporter, the rest of the episode is coming right up. All that stuff I mentioned in the opening. If not, just a quick reminder, full episodes, ad-free, run around 2 hours. They are available to our Patreon supporters, as well as anyone who isn't in a position to financially support the podcast. If you just want to try it out or what have you, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. I will get you set up with that. Or if you'd want to become a Patreon supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or at Politics Guys, as well as through PayPal. And all of that, as always, in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. Thanks so much.